Good morning and welcome to the 9th meeting of 2025 of the SPCB Supported Bodies Landscape Review Committee. Ash Regan MSP has sent her apologies for the start of this meeting and hopes to join us later. I have received no other apologies and I'm joined in the room by Richard Leonard MSP and Lorna Slater MSP, and we have our colleague Myrtle Fraser MSP joining remotely. And today, the committee will take evidence on the New Zealand Officers of Parliament. And in that, we are really pleased to welcome to the committee Dr. David Wilson, Clerk of the House of Representatives of the New Zealand Parliament. Thank you for your time and being with us this morning, Dr. Wilson, and we're really looking forward to hearing your insights, and thank you for taking our questions and joining us in our evidence taking. And I move directly to questions, and the first one is from myself as convener, and it's quite a generic one that at the start of each evidence session we have asked those in front of us what they think the purpose of an SPCB supported body is here. And in that same way, and for completeness, I'd be really grateful if you could outline what the purpose of a New Zealand Officer of Parliament is and what you think its purpose is.
All right, well, look, thank you. It's a pleasure to be in front of you, and good evening from New Zealand. So in terms of the purpose of an Officer of Parliament here, I think it's widely accepted their role is to assist the House of Representatives to scrutinise the Executive and to provide a check on the Executive. And you'll be aware that some criteria for the creation of Officers of Parliament were developed in New Zealand in the late 1980s, which give some shape to that. They talk about the requirements for being an Officer of Parliament must only be created to provide a check on arbitrary use of power by the Executive, and must also discharge functions which the House itself could discharge if it wished to. So I think those are the bounds under which Officers of Parliament are intended to operate, and under which proposals for new ones would be assessed.
Thank you. And just in that space, I mean, how does it work along with the rest of the legislature in that scrutiny and holding that accountability of the Executive?
Yeah, and two of the agencies, the Auditor General and the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, work with the legislature on a regular basis. The Auditor General provides briefings to committees for both budget setting and performance review by committees of the Executive. The Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment frequently is asked to make submissions or give advice to the Environment Committee or to other committees on environmental issues. And both of those agencies have protocols that our Officers of Parliament Committee developed really to set out the terms of engagement, how they might work and what sorts of things they can be asked to do. And I'd be happy to provide those to the committee afterwards if you're interested. The Ombudsman, the Ombudsman is a fairly old office, developed in the 1960s in New Zealand, or introduced in the 1960s in New Zealand, and works with individual members fairly frequently, because one of their roles is, I suppose, is the Public Information Commissioner as well. So when requests under our Freedom of Information legislation are not successful, there is an appeal to the Ombudsman. And so he tends to work with individual members rather than the Parliament as a whole.
Okay, thank you. And those links to other committees are really interesting in the subject expertise that is brought. I mean, do officers of the Parliament Committee operate in the same function as other committees, or is it different because of its unique role and structure? Particularly in terms of, how often does it meet every year, and can you say a bit more about the composition of the committee?
Yes, certainly. So the Officers of Parliament Committee was first established in 1989. There was a select committee inquiry by a Finance and Expenditure Committee into Officers of Parliament. there was a feeling that they were established in an ad hoc way. There were no real principles or guidelines for having them, and they just developed over time. And this
Can I just say that's exactly that's exactly where we find ourselves quite some time later, and why we are in this committee. So that was really interesting. Sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Wilson.
No, that's all right. And that's a characteristic that's fairly common in New Zealand, where we have no written codified constitution, and things just tend to evolve and develop as they're needed, which is very flexible, but perhaps not very structured or principled. So there was an idea that there should be some structure around what the offices of Parliament are. So one of the ideas was to create a parliamentary committee that was first done on an ad hoc basis, but then a few years later was made a regular standing committee that, under standing orders, had to be established in each parliament. And unlike most of our parliamentary committees, it doesn't meet every week. It doesn't have enough business to warrant doing that, but it has some periods of time where it's quite busy. And it might be useful if I just mentioned its functions, because that will give you an idea of where its work falls. So one of the main ones is that it has a role in setting the budgets for the offices of Parliament. And it does that to help uphold their independence from the executive. So whereas for public service agencies in New Zealand, the Cabinet decides ultimately, Parliament passes the appropriation bill, but Cabinet really decides how much money is allocated to each public sector agency. For the offices of Parliament, the role that would be performed by Cabinet is actually performed by the Offices of Parliament Committee. So it receives budget proposals from the offices, it assesses those, it gets advice from the Treasury, but it's able to make recommendations independently of Treasury, and it routinely does. So that's one of their functions, which I can talk a bit more about budget setting if you're interested. It makes appointments, or recommends appointments of officers of Parliament. So there are 4 appointments it makes: the Auditor General and Deputy Auditor General, who are both officers of Parliament, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, and the Ombudsman. And so in that regard, it does something that's quite different to our other committees, because it acts like a recruitment and selection panel. And parliamentary committees are not typically that well suited to that, because they have quite a lot of members, and our ones certainly operate under the basis that most of the information they deal with will become public at some point. So we've had to make some adjustments there, because you can understand that people would be reluctant to apply for a job if their application and CV became publicly available afterwards, as committee proceedings tend to. So there's a few things that operate a little bit differently. It appoints auditors for the 3 offices of Parliament. In practice, it really only does that for the Auditor General, because the Auditor General is the auditor of the other 2 agencies, but can't audit itself, and so the committee finds and recommends appointment of auditors of the Auditor General. If there are proposals for new offices of Parliament, they get referred to the Offices of Parliament Committee to consider, and there have been a number of these proposals over the years. I think mainly connected with the prestige of being an Officer of Parliament. Members or committees will sometimes think, well, here's an important new role, let's make it an Officer of Parliament, because that gives it quite a degree of gravitas. The committee can develop codes of practice for the Officers of Parliament, and it has done that for the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment and the Auditor General. Those codes of practice are about, I think I mentioned how the agencies would interact with Parliament. So it has a different role, which means that it tends to be quite busy around this time of year, dealing with budget proposals from the officers, and only every few years when there's a need to fill a vacancy. Recently, it's met and recommended the appointment of a new Ombudsman who's just been sworn in, because the previous one reached this compulsory retirement age for the Ombudsman of 72. And they're in the process at the moment of recruiting for a new Auditor General, because that's not a position that can be reappointed, and so that term's coming to an end. So at the moment it's got quite a lot of work, but normally if there's no appointments to make, mostly it would just be meeting to deal with budget proposals.
Fascinating. Thanks for sharing all of that. I'm now going to pass to my colleagues to pick up on some of those points and to ask some other questions they've got. So first of all, to Lorna Slater. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. Wilson, for joining us. I'm This is fascinating, and I'm just going to dig into similar points to what the convener was asking about. We have some parallels here in Scotland with your officers in that we also have an ombudsman, we also have an auditor general. We have a couple of other functions which I'm sure you implement in New Zealand, but I'm interested to hear how. So amongst our our SPCB supported bodies, we have a human rights commissioner. So that is, I think that's a fairly common thing in Western democracies to have. We also have a couple of different bodies responsible for standards in public life. So that's making sure that we and local councillors and stuff play by the rules, meet our codes of conduct and that kind of thing. So I'm curious as to how you cover those functions.
Okay, so we have a Human Rights Commissioner and a Human Rights Commission as well. And the other common body that is established in New Zealand are Crown entities. And there are a range of different Crown entities that have different levels of distance and independent from the government of the day. So I'm pretty sure the Human Rights Commission is an independent Crown entity. I can check, but I think that's the case, which means that it's not subject to government or ministerial direction, except in the broadest sense around public finance and reporting to Parliament, that sort of thing. So that's what the Human Rights Commissioner is, and a number of other proposals for officers of Parliament have ended up being independent Crown entities instead. And then the other one, sort of the Commissioners for Standards. We do have a Commissioner for Parliamentary Standards. It's a reasonably new position that arose out of a review of workplace culture at Parliament a few years ago that found, as many parliaments have, that bullying and harassment were all too common. That Commissioner is appointed by the Speaker, and I don't know that we could say that the position has a particular entity status. It just exists at Parliament as a role. It has some powers to report to the House, but it's not a Crown entity. It's not an officer of Parliament. And I think broadly we'd say that the Commissioner was an officer of the House.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm jumping around a little bit, but I'll go back to the point that the convener was making around budgets. You've explained a bit about the sort of process of the officers of the Parliament Committee working annually to set those budgets. How is the transparency and accountability of those allocations done? And just you said there was maybe a bit more detail you could add there.
Yeah, so in terms of the budget setting process, the Speaker of the House for financial matters is considered to be akin to the Minister for the Officers of Parliament. Just with the provisos that the Speaker isn't a minister at all, and it doesn't direct the agencies, but someone in Parliament has got to be answerable for them and ultimately responsible for their appropriations. That's the Speaker in New Zealand. So initially the Officers of Parliament meet with the Speaker and present their proposals, which are then referred to the Treasury so that they can analyse them and prepare some advice. And they will often want to dig into what the Officers of Parliament proposals are, what the justification for them is, whether there are alternatives. And they'll present that information to the Officers of Parliament Committee, as well as some information about general trends in sort of government budget setting and movement in budgets over the year. They will go as far as, the Treasury will go as far as to recommend whether certain changes to the budget be adopted or not, and the committee sometimes takes that advice and sometimes chooses not to. After that's happened, the Officers of Parliament appear before the committee in a closed session, and that's unusual. Usually when people appear in front of committees, it's a public session, but it's because the Officers of Parliament Committee is performing a function that Cabinet performs otherwise, and Cabinet doesn't meet in public, and it would be more difficult to, I think, to make those budget proposals and talk about what's really needed and be frank about it if it was a public session. Once the committee's heard that and considered the Treasury advice, it makes recommendations back to the House in a report, which sets out what, if any, increases or changes to appropriations it recommends. That report is debated. Because the committee has membership from across the House and works usually on a consensus basis, there's not very much debate, and it's probably more of a discussion than debate, in that there are not opposing points of view. The agreement really has already been reached around the budget setting, but once that debate concludes, an address is sent to the Governor-General recommending that those changes to the appropriation be made, and then by convention the government reflects those changes in its budget when it presents it to the House, which is usually in May of each year. So that's why the committee's busy now, because in March and April it needs to get that work done so that the government is informed of it and able to include it in its own budget. I think there might have been a second part to your question, which I've forgotten.
No, that's fine. It was just about the transparency and accountability. So no, I think you've covered that. But unless there's more detail you wanted to add.
Oh, the only other thing I'd add is, so the Offices of Parliament Committee does that budget setting, but it's not the committee that the Offices of Parliament front up to for their annual performance review. Those are done by different committees, some of our subject committees. So the Auditor General appears in front of the Finance and Expenditure Committee, Ombudsman in front of our Governance and Administration Committee, which is responsible for sort of parliamentary and government services, and the Parliamentary Commission for the Environment appears in front of the Environment Committee. And I think that's so there is some separation, so that the budget setting body is not the same one that ultimately considers the performance of these entities.
Right. So
it sits with their subjects.
Understood. Sorry. No, that's fine. So that is the direction I was going to travel in terms of moving into the scrutiny role. But I was curious about the independent Crown entities. One of the challenges we're facing here is we have a bit of a proliferation of not only the offices of the sort of equivalent of the offices of Parliament are SPCB supported bodies, but the public sector landscape generally, which we're trying to get our heads around.
Yes.
Have you noticed the same phenomenon with your independent Crown entities, or how do they fit into the system?
I don't think there's been a recent proliferation of them. I was just checking when the legislation for them was passed. I think it was 2004. So I think they've been reasonably settled over the last 20 years. There are quite a lot of them, and it tends to be the catch-all place to put things that are not either core government departments or offices of Parliament. My own office is another exception. It's an department of the House of Representatives, which is another thing completely, but there are a lot more Crown entities than there are departments, but I don't think that there's a growing number at the moment. So the Crown Entities Act 2004 in New Zealand sets out the different types there are, which is an independent Crown entity, which is independent of the government. Some of those have enforcement or investigative functions, like the Commerce Commission. There are autonomous ones, which operate somewhat independently, and then Crown agents who actually give effect to government policy. So there are a number of them in different tiers.
And just for completeness, so we're understanding how they fit, and how are their budgets allocated and scrutiny of the Crown entities done?
So they make budget proposals through the departments that monitor them. So a government department will have a monitoring relationship with each of them. For the independent Crown entities, it's not monitoring of their activities, it's just of their finances. And they will make their budget proposals through the department that is their monitoring department, which will go to Cabinet, and Cabinet will decide.
Right, and their scrutiny of their functions and performance goes where?
It goes to the different subject select committees. So there are 12 of those.
Right, okay.
They go to those committees. So the Electoral Commission is an independent Crown entity that appears in front of the Justice Committee, for example.
And with respect to that scrutiny by the subject committees of both the offices of Parliament and the Crown entities, is that on any sort of rigorous schedule? Is it annual? Is it up to the committees to decide? Is there a framework around that?
There is a framework, and it's one that's been recently reviewed and strengthened. So our standing orders in Parliament are reviewed every 3 years. There's an automatic 3-yearly review near the end of the Parliament. And one of the recommendations that it made in the last review in 2023 was to strengthen that scrutiny function, which it was felt had become somewhat pro forma and not particularly strong. The result of that was a much more planned approach to scrutiny that committees would need to think at the start of the Parliament which agencies they wanted to scrutinise and when and for how long. An expectation they'd spend a lot more time on it. And this was inspired by the Australian House and Senate committees that spend an enormous amount of time scrutinising their government entities during the estimates process. We don't have quite as much as they do, but it's a big increase on what it used to be. So it is now quite structured. Each committee has to have a plan for its scrutiny. The Finance and Expenditure Committee, which oversees the whole process, nominates certain agencies that must get detailed scrutiny, and they tend to be either very big agencies that spend a lot of taxpayers' money or ones that are controversial or important in some other way. And that happens twice a year. So the annual reviews happen in the last few months of a calendar year and then the first few months of the next calendar year. And the estimates process, looking at budget appropriations and proposals for expenditure, happen between about May and August each year. So they are scheduled and routine and becoming more rigorous.
Brilliant.
And they're the same for everyone.
Understood. So if during scrutiny either an officer of Parliament or one of these Crown entities is found not to be performing effectively against their function, how would this issue be identified and resolved? And are there any examples where this has happened?
So it would, if the committee identified it, and there might very well be different political opinions about that, with members in the government party less inclined to think that government agencies were not performing than opposition parties might think. But the committee can report those findings to the House. It doesn't have an ability to, to force change, except, I guess, by airing the issue, drawing attention to it, and bringing political pressure to bear. So there are certainly plenty of instances where committees have found agencies to be wanting with regard to some of their work, usually not all of it. I don't think they've ever said the whole agency is completely hopeless, but they have said that they're not performing some of their functions as expected. They'll keep a close eye on those things in future reviews. And then if all of those review reports are debated in the House as well. So it is another opportunity then to put ministers under pressure to improve the performance of their departments or entities.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. That's me, Convener.
Thank you very much. And that was really interesting. And we're just moving on from budget setting and scrutiny on to questions of criteria and decision making for creating officers of Parliament, and to probe those issues a little. I'm going to pass to Murdo Fraser, our colleague joining us remotely. Over to you, Murdo.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, or rather, good evening, Dr. Wilson.
Thank you.
Morning for us, evening for you. I'd like to ask a little bit around the criteria for creating new officers. This is an issue that effectively led to this committee being established, because there's a number of proposals we have to set up new commissioners, and we've been tasked to look at how that's taken forward. So can I first of all ask you, what does the decision-making process look like for creating new officers of Parliament? What are the different avenues? Can you maybe give us some examples of where new officers have been proposed, and who's consulted? How does that all come together?
Yeah, certainly. So the Cabinet Manual and our standing orders both talk about how parts of the process for creating a new officer of Parliament. The Cabinet Manual requires that if a minister is proposing to create one, they have to consult early on in that process with the Clerk of the House. And that's because we can apply these criteria and give some advice on how that proposal might work. So that is consultation. It would usually be on a draft cabinet paper, which would then give comment on. And I mean, it wouldn't be up to me to say yes or no to it, but just to say how it would fit with the criteria. After that stage, if the proposal's going ahead, it has to be referred to the Officers of Parliament Committee, and they will draw conclusions about whether they support it or not. They have done that in recent times. The most recent proposal I can think of was for a parliamentary budget officer, which is not a position that we have at the moment, but has been talked about for many years, with two jobs: one to support committees in their scrutiny work, and the other potentially to cost policies of political parties. That hasn't been created yet, but there was a proposal to have one back in 2018, and the proposal was that that person would be an Officer of Parliament. The Officers of Parliament Committee they thought the function was important, they didn't agree it should be an Officer of Parliament. Really, I think because the function of costing political parties policy proposals is not something Parliament would do or would be done on behalf of Parliament, it's something that would be done for parties. And so that proposal didn't proceed. But those are, I guess, the effective gates. The real one is the Officers of Parliament Committee. It can only make recommendations. There's nothing ultimately stopping the government pressing ahead if it has the numbers in the House to do it. But that's just not the way that Officers of Parliament have been created or the way the committee works. And I think those norms and political culture around it are fairly strong. It's not absolute, though. There are these criteria about providing a check on the power of the executive, discharging functions the House might function, the House might perform. The Parliamentary Commission for the Environment doesn't fit those criteria particularly well, because while it's an important role, it has quite a strong advocacy role on environmental issues. It doesn't provide a check on the use of power like the Auditor General does or the Ombudsman does. And it's not really discharging a function that Parliament itself would perform either. But it having received that status, it would be seen as a real downgrading of the office if it was to lose it. And so I think it will stay. And there's no concerns with its work. I think members generally think it does a really good job. But since that time, since the Parliamentary Commission for the Environment was created in 1989, there have been no more Officers of Parliament. So it's been a really long time. There have been a lot of proposals. The Electoral Commissioner was one I mentioned, which is a Crown entity. A Children's Commissioner, a Retirement Commissioner, the Parliamentary Budget Officer. It's been proposed that all of those, a Commissioner for the Treaty of Waitangi, which is the sort of founding agreement between Indigenous Māori and the British Crown. So that role doesn't exist, but there was a proposal it should be an Officer of Parliament. And really the reason is for prestige. It's not to do with these criteria. I'm not sure how well known they are, but they do still exist. Really, it's because it is seen as independent, but also prestigious, and that's often why there are those proposals, but none of them have been successful since then. It's not to say there'll never be one. I could see that if there was a Parliamentary Budget Officer focused on supporting committees and their scrutiny work, possibly it would become one, but we're just not at that stage yet.
That's really helpful. Quite a long list of ones which have been proposed and haven't proceeded. So do these proposals only come from government, or do they come from elsewhere, members of Parliament, etc.? How does that work?
It's a mixture. There was a proposal to have a Deputy Commissioner for the Environment, which was a government idea. Quite often, and the Budget Officer was a government proposal, but quite often they come from members of Parliament who are not in government. I think the Children's Commissioner, the Retirement Commissioner, the Treaty Commissioner, and the idea of the Electoral Commissioner, which is a long-standing position, there's always been one, but a change of their status to be an Officer of Parliament are all ideas that came from members who are not in government.
Yeah, so that's a very similar position to the one we are in, where usually opposition members of Parliament propose a new commissioner. And the ones that were all rejected, was that done on the basis that they did not meet the criteria?
Yes, I think, just thinking through them, the Electoral Commissioner certainly was, and it's really not tenable that it would be an Officer of Parliament, given that it has to actually work quite closely with the government to run the election. And so having some statutory independence works quite well, but really it couldn't be too distant, and it's not providing a check on the executive at all. So I think that's the case, and certainly with the others, as many of them as I can remember the discussions for, it has been around those criteria, and then about what alternatives there might be. And the alternative is, as we mentioned earlier, is almost always a Crown entity, or not having a position at all.
So the criteria was created in 1989. Yes. Has it ever been reviewed or updated? Is there a review mechanism for it, or is it quite settled? It
is quite settled, and it hasn't been reviewed, but it could be. It's not graven in stone or anything. It's just some ideas that a committee had in 1989, which Parliament's accepted and followed. One of the criteria was that the House should, from time to time, review the appropriateness of each Officer of Parliament status, and I don't think it's done that. I don't think it's ever done that. It's certainly stuck with the other principle, though, that an Officer of Parliament should only be created rarely. It seems to have shut the door on that in 1989.
Yeah, it does sound like that.
Yes, absolutely.
So I suppose then my last question, given what you just said, that the principle is they should only be created rarely. There haven't been any since 1989. So I suppose how does the committee then balance that requirement not to only to create new officers rarely, but there might be some compelling need? How does that issue get resolved?
Yeah, I don't think that the committee members would think, well, it hasn't been long enough, we can't make one. I think it's really just a caution that this should not be the default position of all new bodies, and you can see that that's been taken to heart. It's not. But yeah, I mean, there could very well be a compelling case for a new commissioner and a new Officer of Parliament in the future. I don't think too much weight would be given to the fact that there hasn't been one for a long time if the other criteria are met, particularly about the check on the executive and discharging functions of the House.
Okay, thank you. That's really all I have to ask, unless there's anything you want to add about the criteria for creating new officers that we haven't covered.
I can't think of anything else. Those criteria are, I mean, those are what we look to when we're giving advice on proposals. And I think it's fair to say parties across the House over many years have taken that really seriously, and they don't push for it unless they had a really compelling case. And some of these have gone to other subject committees as in draft legislation and been rejected. I think that having a deputy parliamentary commissioner for the environment was rejected by a parliamentary committee, not the Officers of Parliament committee, a different one.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And again, really fascinating. And now to move on to some consideration further on governance and funding, I'm going to pass to Richard Leonard.
Good evening, Dr. Wilson. Could I explore a little bit more some of the things that you've already touched on a little in the earlier part of the session this morning or this evening? I'm trying to understand how a new body is designated as either a Crown entity or an Officer of Parliament. I mean, what is the criteria which is applied to determine how a new body is categorised? And I suppose following on from that, what are the differences in the governance arrangements between those two distinct categories?
Okay, thank you. So the legal distinction would be made in legislation. Officers of Parliament are required to have their own standalone statute, and the three that we have now each have one. And Crown entities may or may not be created by a separate statute. They will be created in statute, and that would say they are a Crown entity, what kind they are, and then the schedule to the Crown Entities Act would also be amended to reflect their existence. In terms of the decision-making around it, it has been, to date, has been applying those criteria. If there is a desire to create the role at all, in some cases, such as the Commissioner for the Treaty of Waitangi, there isn't widespread interest in having one, and so not much thought has been given to that. But to others where people agree that their role should exist, like the Children's Commissioner and the Retirement Commissioner, really a lot of weight I think is given to the criteria once we bring them to the House's attention. Just because they're quite old, they're not, front of mind for people necessarily. And if it's accepted that the entity shouldn't be an Officer of Parliament, then there's always a discussion about what else it should be. And Crown entities, I think it's fair to say, are the catch-all for everything that is not a government department, directly responsible to a minister or an Officer of Parliament. We do have a few sort of more business-oriented government entities that are called state-owned enterprises, but they are state monopolies that operate to generate profit that are regulated by the government and owned by the government. Our airline is one of them, Air New Zealand, but really they don't figure into this picture because they're quite distant and they've got a different sort of purpose. So usually it's what kind of Crown entity should something be if it's not going to be an officer of Parliament.
And can I follow that up, Dr. Wilson, by again trying to understand the distinction which there is between a body which is an autonomous Crown entity and one which is an independent Crown entity? Because you mentioned there the Retirement Commissioner and the Children and Young People's Commission. I think the Retirement Commissioner is classified as an autonomous Crown entity, whereas the Children and Young People's Commission is ascribed to being an independent Crown entity. What's the difference between those two categorisations?
So it's different degrees of distance from the Crown and kind of immunity to taking instruction from ministers. And so I think the reason that the Children's Commissioner will be an independent Crown entity is that it has a role in overseeing and critiquing the welfare agency that is responsible for children, the government department that actually looks after children and young people. Whereas the Retirement Commissioner, the role is primarily to promote retirement savings and to advocate that people sort of think about and prepare for their retirement. And so it doesn't have the same oversight role. So it is closer to the Crown in being an autonomous Crown entity. So there are degrees of difference in how much instruction they have to take, what sort of interactions they have with ministers and departments. In the end, their budgets are all set the same way by Cabinet through monitoring agencies, but how they perform their functions, what their functions are, and their legislation might say that they must perform these functions independently of a minister or of the government for an independent Crown entity.
Okay, and you mentioned earlier on in the session about powers of enforcement, that some of these bodies have enforcement powers. Could you give us an example of one of these Crown entities that's got enforcement powers?
So the Commerce Commission has powers to investigate and to compel the production of information. I think also that it can prosecute. I'm not completely clear on the details of that, but I certainly know it can require the production of information as a statutory power. Okay. So can the Officers of Parliament. I think all three of them can, certainly the Ombudsman and the Auditor General can.
Yeah, well, so we've had an instance in the UK where the Parliamentary Ombudsman made a recommendation around the treatment of women's retirement age being changed, and the Ombudsman determined that there had been maladministration by a government department. But it was just a recommendation to Parliament, and the government chose not to implement that recommendation. I mean, in the case of the Ombudsman in New Zealand, do they have powers of enforcement, for example, or do they just simply have powers to recommend?
They have powers to recommend, and I think the only compulsion, there's two. I think the two areas where they have compulsion is that they must be provided information if they ask for it, and they've got the right to, enter premises. Our Ombudsman is also our independent monitor for crimes of torture in prisons, and tends to get loaded with a lot of these sorts of independent monitor roles as well. And they have some statutory rights there to enter prisons unannounced and interview prisoners and things like that. But generally the Ombudsman's powers are not to require anyone to do anything. I think the only power like that it has is that it can require a minister to explain to the House why they have chosen not to comply with the recommendation. So again, it's bringing sort of political pressure to bear rather than having an enforcement power of its own.
Okay, and you've got, and again, one of the Crown entities which has been outlined to us is a takeovers panel. I mean, the takeovers panel here would have the power to block a merger or acquisition. Is that the same in the New Zealand model?
I don't know, I'm sorry. Okay. And I don't want to put you wrong, so I won't guess.
Okay, okay. Can I just turn to this kind of process of review that you have? I mean, one of the existing criteria of the Officers of Parliament model is that the House should, from time to time, review the appropriateness of each Officer of Parliament status as an Officer of Parliament. I mean, how does that work in practice? Is it every 5 years there is a review, or is it as and when required, or what are the rules around that, Dr. Wilson?
I think it's perhaps it's as and when required, and it's not yet been required. I'm as far as I'm aware, there's never been any thought given to whether any of the three should continue to be officers of Parliament. And as I say, I think there is a legitimate question. If you were creating a parliamentary commissioner for the environment now, possibly that wouldn't be the model. But there's no thought of taking that status away. It would be a major downgrading of any of the three of them to do that. But I don't think members or the House has ever given it any attention since they were created.
And Dr. Wilson, what about the Crown entities? Is there any kind of sunset clause for them? Is there any quinquennial review of their roles? Do they have to be the subject of that kind of process of time-to-time review?
I think that it is as and when and actually happens. Unlike with the officers of Parliament. So if the government wants it to take on new functions or is not sure the function's still required, there's a review then. As far as I'm aware, there's not ongoing reviews. And I think one of the reasons is that the Crown entities are monitored by quite a wide range of different government departments. There's no central agency with oversight of all of them. And so I don't think there's probably been a coordinated review of them. The last thing like that, I think, would be the Crown Entities Act in 2004, where every existing agency was looked at and thought was given to what sort of entity it should be, if it should be a Crown entity. But that was to support new legislation because it had been developed in a really ad hoc way for a huge range of different bodies.
OK, thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you very, very much, Richard. And just on that, is there any discussion in the Parliament around the number of the Crown entities that there are? Just because this is one of the questions, we're being asked to look at specific bodies here that our Parliament is responsible for, but of course there's a plethora of government bodies as well and commissioners. And I just wondered, in terms of the public discourse in New Zealand, is this something that Parliament is interested in and explores and considers regularly?
I don't think it considers it regularly in any kind of scheduled or routine way. The government that was elected at the end of 2023 was interested in reducing the size of the public sector. It's a centre-right government, so that's just consistent with its general political approach. And it's, as far as I know, there's not been a reduction in the number of entities, but there has been a reduction in their budgets and their headcount. So I'm not aware of any reduction in the number of Crown entities or government departments. But I should also say that if there was any government thinking about changing Crown entities, I also probably wouldn't know about it unless legislation was involved, because I'm not working with the government. But I think I feel fairly confident saying that that doesn't happen.
Thank you, and it's very interesting how because of the criteria and just the way that processes have been in place since 1989. The way that, as a Parliament, you've kept the offices of Parliament really tight and structured. Whereas looking at the list of Crown entities, there is a bit more kind of a less streamlined and perhaps systematic way that they seem to have been developed. Just on process, kind of going back a bit to one of the other discussions that we had this morning in your answers, it'd just be really good to just get a little bit more clarity on the process in terms of when there's a proposal for an officer of Parliament. Does it go to the Officers of Parliament committee before it's in legislation? And then is it, if once it becomes legislation, is it considered again once introduced by the committee? And during any scrutiny like that, do subject committees refer to the criteria as well? So you talked about earlier how some possibilities of officers of Parliament have been considered by, for example, the Environment Committee. I mean, do they apply the criteria in the same way?
Yeah. So the timeline for a proposal would be I'd get consulted on the draft cabinet paper and give that advice around the criteria. If it's going to proceed, then the Officers of Parliament Committee would be consulted before legislation was introduced. So on a minister's proposal to create a new Officer of Parliament, they'd write to the committee, and this is what happened with the proposal around the Parliamentary Budget Office, wrote to the committee and say, this is, we're intending on, well, we think we should create a new Officer of Parliament, this is what they do, and what do you think? And so the committee would make a response then. If it was still going to be in legislation as introduced, then the legislation would be referred to a subject select committee, because almost all legislation is for public submissions, and that subject committee could draw its own conclusions about the appropriateness of a new Officer of Parliament. It might receive public submissions on it. The Officers of Parliament Committee can also write to other committees and give its opinion without being invited to, and I think it would. That's most likely going to happen where, say, during the course of committee consideration of a bill, a member or members have an idea that there should be a new Officer of Parliament. So it wasn't in the bill to start with, but it's something that's come up with during the committee's deliberations. And then they'd be expected to put that proposal to the Officers of Parliament Committee. If not, the committee would write to them anyway, write to the other committee anyway with its own view. And I think the mechanism for making sure that would happen would be the committee secretariat if it didn't occur to the members anyway, and it might not, just given that it's the criteria from 1989 and haven't been touched since. So I think one way or another input from the Officers of Parliament Committee would be received even at a later stage. There's not been an instance of an Officer of Parliament proposal proceeding where there's not widespread support across the House for it. So even when a government has sufficient numbers in the House to create one, as they would have with the budget officer, they just don't do that if there's not widespread support. And the same is true for budget setting and also for recommending appointments as Officers of Parliament.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful clarification. I'm now going to hand back to Lorna Slater to ask questions on support and resources for Officers of Parliament. So over to you again, Lorna.
Thank you very much, Convener. Dr. Wilson, I'll get into some of the more practical kind of operational questions just now about things like shared offices, IT systems, HR support. How does that work? I mean, I'm curious for both the Offices of Parliament and the independent Crown entities, what kind of resources they are supplied, whether they're expected to use common office space, common HR support, that kind of thing. Each of them operates separately. They're resourced separately, and they don't. I'm not aware of any resources that the three Officers of Parliament share. They each have their own premises. They all have their own staff, including corporate and HR and IT staff. So there's some duplication there. But I think because they've been created in an ad hoc way over many years, the Ombudsman in the 1960s, the Auditor General has existed as a role for as long as New Zealand's had a parliament, and the Commissioner for the Environment's newer. That's just symptomatic of how things have been created in New Zealand, and so they have all been set up as standalone agencies to operate autonomously from each other. In terms of size, the Auditor General's office is by far the largest. It's got hundreds of staff, including audit staff. The Ombudsman would be the next largest, I think, with about 200 staff and offices in 2 cities. And the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment is very small, I think under 30 staff, and just has an office in Wellington. And the one thing that they can all make use of is the research services the Parliamentary Library provides. So they are able to request research to be done by the library, and they do from time to time. But apart from that, they all operate separately from each other.
The only time that I can think Parliament accommodated the Parliamentary Commission of the Environment for a while after some severe earthquakes when there were, shortage of buildings, but that was a short-term measure. Apart from that, they all operate in their own premises and in their own way.
So those...
Sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say the same is true of Crown entities. Some of those are fairly small, some of them are very large, and they all work in their own premises and in their own way.
So, for example, the rent of their premises would come out of their budgets. That's not provided directly by Parliament or through government buildings. That's
correct. The rent would come out of their budgets. Yep.
One of the things that we've been talking about here is the kind of consumer or constituent experience. If you have a problem, something's gone wrong with a public service, where do you go? Do you go to the Ombudsman? Do you go to the Standards Commissioner? Because who do you speak to here in Scotland? Do you have any thoughts for how that works in New Zealand? If you're a New Zealand citizen, something's gone wrong, how do you know where to go? Is there kind of a front page, a dashboard, a one-stop shop from where you can be directed correctly to the Ombudsman or the Human Rights Commissioner and so on?
Mm-hmm. The government maintains a directory, which is online, which tells you what all the agencies are and where they are and what sorts of things you might see them about. I don't know how well that's used. I don't know. Sorry, how many people would look at it. The Ombudsman is perhaps the Ombudsman and members of Parliament are the sources people turn to the most, and sometimes members and their staff will direct people to the Ombudsman because that might be the place to resolve their issue, because the Ombudsman's core job of sort of investigating failures in the public sector is fairly well known and has existed for quite a long time and is used very often, to the extent that the Ombudsman is almost always coming to the Offices of Parliament Committee asking for more funding to have more staff to do more work and deal with the backlog of complaints. I think that the Ombudsman would be the closest thing to a one-stop shop for people. And MPs and Parliament is probably the other one.
Right.
There are... Sorry, I should say, obviously there are more niche ones. If you have a criminal problem, obviously there's the police. And there are some business-oriented ones for as well. But really, I think people would tend to think of the Ombudsman if they were to think of one body to go to.
I've got another question, which is more for my own interest, if the convener will allow. And that is, one of the conversations we've been having here is about proactive and reactive work that these sort of commissioners do in terms of Ombudsman deals with something that has gone wrong, but whose job is it to do the research, to have the foresight to see something before it goes wrong? Just to put that in context, our Ombudsman here, for example, can react to complaints that they've heard of, but maybe they have complaints from 2 local authorities. They don't have the powers to then start an investigation into all local authorities, even though they might have the idea that this was a more general problem. They don't have that power to go and to look at in a more investigative way with the intention of preventing future problems. Do you have any bodies that have that sort of proactive prevention role?
The Auditor General can conduct inquiries very broadly into matters on their own motion, and they do that all the time. They have an ongoing program of inquiries. The Auditor General consults Parliament every year. They have a work program. They say we're thinking of looking at local government this year, or water storage, or they do go quite broadly beyond just money, and they consult with Parliament and take that into account. But the Auditor General actually decides what the program will be. So that's ongoing. People can complain to the Auditor General about misuse of public funds as well, but it can, in its own right, to look at those things if it wants to. The Parliamentary Commission of the Environment, their work program is inquiries. They tend not to be ones where an individual has raised a concern. They tend to be larger systemic environmental issues. The Ombudsman receives a lot of complaints, and I think I'd need to check and tell the committee after the hearing whether they can conduct inquiries on their own motion or not. My feeling is they can, but I don't want to mislead you if that's not the case. So I'll check and let the committee secretariat know.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. And just a few final questions from myself, Dr. Wilson. I presume that ahead of today, although appreciating you're a busy person in a busy place as well, but you may have seen some of what we've been considering and the way that our setup is here in Scotland. And I just wondered if there was anything that came to mind when you were looking at that, or anything that you thought was interesting, different, perplexing about our setup here in Scotland.
I'm not sure that I've looked closely enough to be able to tell you that. I do think that what you're doing is a really good idea, because of our example of drifting on and only thinking about things when there's a pressing reason to. So you may have reached that point where you feel there is now a pressing reason to do it in Scotland. I think it's a very good idea to try and get some discipline and some systems around it, because it's always tempting to create new agencies. That's happened in New Zealand, though not offices of Parliament. So no, I don't think there's anything I could reflect on about your own experience or tell you what to do there, but this seems like the process you're undertaking now seems like a good one.
That's helpful. And just lastly, is there anything that you wanted to express to us or emphasise to us today that you thought might be helpful that you haven't had a chance to, with regard to how things operate in New Zealand?
I think there's just two things I'd mention. And I did touch on one of them, which is the Officers of Parliament Committee always operates on a consensus basis. So there have been times where they couldn't agree about a candidate for one of the roles, for example, and they've started the process again rather than forcing it through against the will of any of the parties. And that's because they want the Officers of Parliament to start in their roles with the confidence of the entire House. And actually, that's just reminded me of one other thing, if there's time, that I should probably mention. And that is about removal of Officers of Parliament. So they're very difficult to remove. It has to be done by an address to the Governor-General from the House of Representatives, which means a motion is brought to the House, it's debated, and they can only be removed on specific grounds around incapacity, mental disability, bankruptcy. I think there might be one more. But they're deliberately very difficult to remove from their roles. The Auditor-General can't be reappointed, and so that tends to reinforce their independence. The Auditor-General's other role is as controller of public finances, and there was a time when the Auditor-General stopped payments by the government because he didn't think they were properly authorised, which didn't make him at all popular with the government of the day, but there was nothing that could be done about it, and his career wasn't in jeopardy because he couldn't be reappointed anyway. So thinking about the worst case scenario for them is a useful exercise. We did have a situation in 2016 where the House lost confidence in the Auditor-General at the time across the entire House. There's not a lot of public information about it because the Auditor-General resigned rather than being removed from office. But he had been the chief executive of a public agency where one of his staff had committed quite significant fraud. It was felt that had happened under his nose, and really he should have responded to some of the warnings he received. This is publicly available. I'm not telling you anything secret here. But it was felt any other position other than the Auditor-General that might be okay, a bit of a stain on their career, but not fatal. But members across the whole House just couldn't see how someone could be the Auditor-General in that situation because they hadn't responded to any of these warnings about fraud. And so those removal provisions were tested then, and they were quite robust. It's pretty difficult to do. And I think that's a good thing that reinforces the independence of those roles. They all have identical provisions. And yes, while that could happen, it's obviously a very public process and one where Parliament really wants to be sure of what it's doing. So there is, the Ministry of Justice is supposed to be doing some work on the appointment and removal criteria for officers of Parliament, just to check that they are robust and up to date and would withstand being used if necessary. It hasn't done that work as far as I'm aware because of government priorities for its time. But I think that is, when you're thinking about officers of Parliament, making sure they have that independence and a high degree of protection is fairly important. I think there's one other smaller point, which is that we talked about accountability of the officers of Parliament to Parliament, and they go through the same processes as government agencies do there. Occasionally there'll be complaints about a substantive decision usually of the Ombudsman, sometimes of the Auditor General, and those complaints are usually sent to the Speaker. They're quite difficult to know what to do with or to find a home for, because the officers of Parliament in each of their statutes says that they perform their functions independently, and so really there is no where to go if someone is not satisfied with the decision that they've made. And that's probably not very satisfactory. It's not common, and I'm not proposing that another entity be created to deal with it, but I'm just aware of the fact that they tend not to go anywhere. People either complain to the committees that do the scrutiny work or to the Speaker. Because these entities are independent, they might ask the Ombudsman or the Auditor General for some comment on the issue, but they tend not to proceed any further. They're fairly rare, and there's not been any move to set up any kind of formal mechanism for them, but it is a small gap, I suppose. And I think that's it.
That was really helpful additional information at the end there. Dr. Wilson, thank you. Colleagues, do we have any further questions in the room? Myrtle, Fraser? No? Okay. Well, I just would like to thank you again, Dr. Wilson, for your time and insights. We've been really grateful to hear you this morning where we are, this evening where you are, and we appreciate it. And if there's anything you do want to follow up with, I know you mentioned at one point you could follow up with a bit further detail, then that we'd also be grateful for that. So with gratitude, that concludes the public part of our meeting today, and as previously agreed by the committee, we now move into private session.
Okay, thank you everyone, and good luck with your work.